People like you don't belong here. The words didn't echo, they landed, heavy and final, like a door slamming shut in a room full of witnesses who suddenly forgot how to breathe. The dinner rush froze in place, forks hovering midair, conversations cut off mid-sentence, the soft hum of the restaurant collapsing into a silence that felt too sharp to touch. Ava Johnson stood there, her tray balanced perfectly in one hand, not trembling, not lowering, just still, like she had practiced standing in moments like this her entire life. The overhead lights reflected faintly against the polished glass behind her, catching the outline of her figure, her uniform pressed but worn at the edges, the kind of wear that came from long nights and early mornings stacked back to back. Richard Coleman didn't raise his voice again. He didn't need to. His presence filled the space more than any volume ever could. Tailored suit, silver watch catching the light, posture carved from control and certainty. He didn't look at her like a person. He looked at her like a problem already solved. "You're done here," he added, quieter now, almost bored, as if dismissing her required less effort than finishing his drink. A few tables away, someone shifted in their seat, eyes flicking between them, unsure whether to look or pretend not to. The manager stood near the bar, frozen with a notepad still in hand, not stepping in, not stepping away. Ava didn't argue. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. Her fingers tightened just slightly around the edge of the tray, the smallest movement, almost invisible, but enough to ground her. Somewhere behind her, a glass clinked against another, too loud in the silence, and then nothing again. The air felt colder, thinner, like the room itself had pulled back. Richard reached into his jacket, pulled out a card, and set it on the table without looking down. His attention had already moved on. To him, this moment was over. To everyone else, it hadn't even begun to settle. Ava finally moved, just one step forward, placing the tray down on the nearest service station with a quiet precision that didn't match the weight of what had just happened. She straightened, smoothing the front of her uniform, her expression calm, unreadable, but her eyes, steady, focused, holding something deeper than anger. Something patient. Something that didn't rush. She turned slightly, just enough to face him again, not fully, not confrontational, just present. "Sir?" she said, her voice even, controlled, carrying just enough to reach him without breaking the fragile stillness around them. "Some mistakes don't disappear." A pause. Not long, but long enough to shift something unseen in the room. Richard didn't respond. He didn't even turn. One of his colleagues let out a quiet breath, almost a scoff, as if the sentence meant nothing. But Ava didn't fill the silence. She let it sit there, suspended, like a weight no one wanted to claim. Then she reached for her apron strings, untied them slowly, folding the fabric once, twice, placing it beside the tray as if closing a chapter no one else had bothered to read. Her movements were careful, deliberate, each one measured, not rushed, not hesitant. The kind of control that didn't come from confidence alone, but from knowing exactly when to stop speaking. She walked past him without another word, her footsteps soft against the polished floor, disappearing into the narrow hallway that led to the back, where the light shifted from warm gold to a colder, harsher white. No one stopped her. No one called after her. The door swung closed behind her with a muted click that barely registered over the return of quiet murmurs slowly creeping back into the room. Richard picked up his glass, took a slow sip, and for a moment, just a fraction, his hand paused midair, something unspoken brushing against the edges of his focus before he pushed it aside. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. As far as he was concerned, the problem had already walked out the door. The back hallway smelled faintly of bleach and lemon polish, the kind of scent that clung to uniforms long after a shift ended, and Ava Johnson moved through it without slowing, her footsteps steady, measured, like she was following a path she had already walked 100 times before. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered just slightly, casting a pale glow that flattened everything it touched, turning stainless steel counters and supply carts into cold reflections of a world that did not care who passed through it. She reached the small locker area, no larger than a walk-in closet, and stopped in front of the narrow metal door with her number scratched faintly into the paint. For a moment, she did not open it. Her hand rested against the cool surface, fingers still, breath even, as if she was listening for something beneath the silence. Then she pulled it open. Inside, there was not much. A folded hoodie, soft from years of wear. A canvas tote bag with frayed edges. A thin notebook tucked into the corner, its spine bent from being opened too many times. She reached for the hoodie first, slipping it over her uniform, the fabric warmer than the room, grounding in a way the restaurant never was. In the reflection of the locker door, she caught a glimpse of herself, not as the staff saw her, not as the customers saw her, but as something quieter, something more deliberate. Her eyes did not carry shock. They did not carry anger. They carried memory. Somewhere beyond the walls, dishes clattered again, voices rising back into their normal rhythm, the world correcting itself as if nothing had shifted at all. Ava closed the locker gently and slung the tote over her shoulder, the weight familiar, comforting in its simplicity. As she turned toward the exit, Carmen stood by the doorway, arms crossed loosely, her expression caught between concern and something she did not quite say. "You all right?" Carmen asked, her voice low, careful, like stepping onto thin ice. Ava nodded once. "I will be." It was not reassurance. It was a statement. Carmen studied her for a second longer, then stepped aside, letting her pass without another word. Outside, the night air was cooler than she expected, carrying a faint breeze that moved through the street in quiet waves. The neon sign above the restaurant buzzed softly, casting a red glow across the sidewalk, stretching shadows longer than they should be. Ava paused just beneath it, looking up for a brief second, the light catching along the edges of her face before she stepped forward. Into the darker part of the street. Cars passed, headlights sliding across the pavement, people moving in small clusters, laughter drifting in and out like fragments of a life she had never quite stepped into. She walked past them all, not fast, not slow, just steady. At the corner, she stopped, reaching into her tote and pulling out the thin notebook. The cover was worn, corners softened, pages slightly uneven from use. She opened it to a marked page, her fingers moving without hesitation, as if guided by something deeper than habit. Numbers filled the page. Columns, notes, small annotations written in tight, precise handwriting. She traced one line with her finger, then another, her eyes narrowing just slightly as the pattern settled into place again. The same pattern she had seen earlier that night. The same one she had tried to warn about. A car horn sounded somewhere behind her, pulling her back for a moment, but she did not close the notebook. Instead, she turned the page. More numbers. More connections. The city noise continued around her, indifferent, unaware. Ava exhaled slowly, her breath visible for just a second in the cooler air, then fading. She slipped the notebook back into her bag and adjusted the strap on her shoulder, her posture straightening just a fraction more. Somewhere across town, in an office lined with glass and steel, decisions were still being made, signatures still being prepared, numbers still being trusted without question. She stepped off the curb as the light changed, crossing the street without looking back. Behind her, the restaurant continued as if she had never been there. Ahead of her, the night stretched open, quiet and waiting, holding something unseen just beneath its surface. And Ava Johnson walked into it with the same calm certainty she had carried inside, as if the moment that had just passed was not an ending, but a point she had already accounted for long before anyone else realized it mattered. By the time Ava reached her apartment, the city had settled into that quiet hour where the noise did not disappear, it just softened into something distant and constant, like a low hum beneath everything. Her building stood at the edge of a narrow street lined with aging brick and flickering streetlights, the kind that buzzed faintly before holding steady. She climbed the stairs without turning on the overhead light, her steps familiar, measured, counting each one without needing to look. Inside, the space was small but orderly, a single room with a kitchenette tucked into one corner, a narrow desk by the window, and a bed that had been made with careful precision. The air carried a faint scent of coffee and paper, warm and quiet, untouched since the morning. Ava set her tote down on the desk and slipped off her shoes, placing them side by side beneath the chair. For a moment, she just stood there, looking at the surface of the desk as if it held something more than what was visible. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out the notebook again, laying it flat under the soft yellow light of the desk lamp. The glow pulled across the page, catching the ink in a way that made the numbers seem almost raised, almost alive. She flipped to the earlier entry, the one she had traced at the corner, and sat down slowly, her posture straight, her breathing steady. A clock ticked somewhere in the room, each second marking time that felt more deliberate than usual. She picked up a pen and began writing, not quickly, not hesitantly, but with a controlled rhythm that suggested she already knew where each line would go before it appeared. Columns expanded. Notes deepened. Small arrows connected figures that did not belong together at first glance but settled into place when seen as a whole. Outside, a car passed, headlights sweeping briefly across the wall, then gone. Ava did not look up. Her focus narrowed, drawing inward, pulling the world into the page in front of her. Across town, on the top floor of a glass tower that reflected the city lights like a mirror, Richard Coleman stood at the head of a long conference table, the surface polished to a shine that held the reflections of every person seated around it. The room was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that came from uncertainty. This was controlled, deliberate, the kind of silence that followed authority. A projection screen glowed faintly at the far end, displaying rows of financial data, projections, and final figures waiting for approval. Richard rested one hand on the back of a chair, the other holding a pen that he tapped lightly against the table, the sound sharp and rhythmic. "We finalized tonight," he said, his voice calm, certain, carrying easily across the room without force. A few executives nodded, their eyes moving between the screen and the documents in front of them. No one questioned the numbers. No one slowed the process. The assumption of accuracy moved through the room like air, invisible but absolute. One analyst hesitated for a fraction of a second, fingers hovering above a tablet, then lowered them without speaking. Richard did not notice. Or if he did, it did not register as important. He stepped forward, glancing briefly at the figures, his gaze scanning but not stopping. The pen in his hand hovered just above the signature line of the final document. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the motion that would seal everything into place. The city lights beyond the glass stretched out in quiet patterns, steady and unchanging. Back in her apartment, Ava paused, her pen lifting slightly above the page as her eyes settled on a sequence she had just written. She tilted her head just a fraction, then drew a line through one column, rewriting it beside another, aligning it differently. The pattern shifted. The numbers spoke again, clearer this time. She leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, her gaze fixed on the page as if listening to something beneath the surface. Then she reached for her phone, unlocked it, and opened a blank email. The cursor blinked once. Twice. She did not type yet. Instead, she looked back at the notebook, then at the screen, her expression steady, resolved. Across the city, Richard's pen touched the paper. He did not hesitate. He did not look back. The decision moved forward, clean and final, carried by certainty that had never been questioned. And in the quiet space of a small apartment, under a single lamp, Ava Johnson sat with the truth laid out in front of her, complete, precise, and waiting for the moment when it would no longer be ignored. The email did not begin with emotion and it did not ask for permission. It opened with numbers, clean and unadorned, each line placed with a precision that did not need explanation, and Ava Johnson typed slowly, deliberately, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the same steady rhythm she had used on paper, the glow from the screen reflecting faintly in her eyes as if the data itself carried light. She attached the file last, a single document, structured, annotated, impossible to dismiss without reading, and when she finally pressed send, the soft click of the key felt louder than it should have, like a signal released into a system that did not yet know it was about to change. She did not watch for a reply, did not refresh the screen, did not linger in that moment. Instead, she closed the laptop halfway and leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the window where the city lights stretched outward. Distant and constant, the same lights that reflected off the glass tower where decisions had already been made. Across that tower, several floors below the conference room. A late shift accounting assistant named Daniel Reyes sat at his desk, shoulders slightly hunched, tie loosened just enough to breathe, his eyes moving across incoming messages with the dull focus of someone expecting nothing unusual, until one subject line paused him mid-scroll. It was not flagged, not marked urgent, but it carried something else, a structure, a clarity that stood out against the routine flow of internal reports. He clicked it without thinking, more out of instinct than curiosity, and the document opened cleanly, columns aligned, notes precise, each section building on the last with a logic that tightened as he read. His fingers hovered above the keyboard, then lowered, then hovered again, his posture straightening almost imperceptibly as the pattern began to form in his mind. He scrolled back to the top, reading it again, slower this time, the silence around his desk growing heavier as the weight of what he was seeing settled into place. Somewhere above him, the final documents had already been signed, the meeting dispersed, the assumption of completion moving through the building like a quiet conclusion. But here, on his screen, something did not align. Daniel glanced toward the glass office down the hall, empty now, lights dimmed, then back at the document. His breath slowed. He reached for his mouse and highlighted a section, comparing it against the internal report he had reviewed earlier that evening. The difference was small at first glance, a shift in allocation, a subtle redistribution of liability, but when he followed the thread deeper, it expanded, revealing layers that had been hidden beneath terminology that most would not question. His jaw tightened slightly. He leaned back, running a hand across his chin, then leaned forward again, closer this time, as if proximity would change what he was seeing. It did not. The numbers remained the same. Precise, consistent, undeniable. He checked the sender again. Unfamiliar, external. Not part of the executive chain, not someone who should have access to this level of analysis, and yet the work spoke with a confidence that did not match its origin. Daniel's cursor hovered over the forward button, hesitating, then pulling back. His eyes moved once more across the page, slower now, searching for error, for miscalculation, for anything that would allow him to dismiss it. He found none. The building around him remained quiet, air conditioning humming softly through the vents. A distant elevator bell ringing somewhere down the hall, ordinary sounds that felt disconnected from the shift taking place at his desk. Finally, he exhaled, a controlled release of breath, and moved the cursor again, this time not hesitating. The document forwarded, not broadly, not carelessly, but directly, upward, to a name that rarely received anything unfiltered. The message left his screen without announcement, carried through systems that processed it without understanding its weight. Daniel leaned back again, his gaze lingering on the now empty inbox, a subtle tension settling into his shoulders. Above, in a private office lined with glass and quiet authority, a notification appeared on a screen that had already been prepared to move on to the next decision, and though no one reacted yet, something had entered the space that did not belong to routine. Back in her apartment, Ava reached forward and closed the laptop completely, the soft click final, her hands resting for a moment on the surface as if acknowledging the steps she had just taken. She stood slowly, walked to the window, and looked out over the same city that had just begun to shift in a way no one could yet see. Her reflection faint against the glass, calm, steady, unchanged, as if the outcome was not something she needed to chase, but something she had already set in motion long before anyone else realized it was coming. Morning did not arrive gently in the glass tower. It arrived in layers of sound that built faster than usual, keyboards tapping with sharper rhythm, voices lower but tighter, footsteps moving with purpose instead of routine, and by the time Richard Coleman stepped out of the elevator onto the executive floor, something in the air had already shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like pressure before a storm that no one had announced. He noticed it not through words but through absence, the absence of casual greetings, the absence of eye contact that usually came with quiet confidence, replaced now with brief nods and glances that moved away too quickly. He adjusted his cuff as he walked, posture unchanged, expression steady, but his pace slowed just enough to register the difference. Inside the main conference room, screens were already active, data pulled up again though it had been finalized the night before. Lines of numbers stretching across the display with small highlighted Sections that had not been there before. Daniel Reyes stood near the far end of the table, tablet in hand, speaking in a controlled voice to two senior analysts who listened without interrupting, their faces drawn into focus rather than agreement. When Richard entered, the room did not stop, it tightened. Daniel's voice paused mid-sentence, then resumed, quieter now, but the weight remained. Richard stepped forward, his gaze moving from face to face before settling on the screen. "Why are we reopening closed figures?" he asked, not loudly, but with a precision that expected immediate clarity. No one answered right away. One of the analysts shifted, clearing his throat slightly, but did not speak. Daniel stepped forward instead, holding the tablet just slightly higher, as if presenting something that did not belong to hierarchy but to fact. "There is a discrepancy in the liability allocation," he said, each word measured. "It appears consistent across multiple sections of the agreement." Richard's expression did not change, but his eyes narrowed just enough to signal attention. "Appears," he repeated, the word resting between skepticism and dismissal. Daniel did not lower his gaze. "It is not random," he added, tapping the screen once to expand a section. "It follows a pattern that shifts risk entirely onto our side under specific conditions." The room fell into a deeper silence, not from uncertainty now, but from recognition that something concrete had entered the space. Richard stepped closer, the polished surface of the table reflecting the data. Upward, faint and distorted, he scanned the highlighted lines, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, fingers still, pen absent now. For a moment, the numbers looked like any other set of figures, structured, clean, justified by language that had passed review. Then his gaze moved to the annotations, small but precise, connecting points that had not been connected before. His jaw tightened slightly. "Who flagged this?" he asked, not looking up. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, not from doubt, but from the weight of the answer. "It came from an external analysis," he said. Richard's head lifted slowly. "External?" The word sharper now, cutting through the controlled tone. "Yes, sir," Daniel replied. "The work is detailed, consistent, and aligns with the original draft in ways that suggest it is not speculative." One of the senior analysts leaned in, scrolling through the document on the screen, his brow furrowing as he followed the lines deeper. "If this holds," he said quietly, almost to himself, "we are exposed far beyond the projected threshold." The room shifted again, this time not subtly. Richard reached for the tablet Daniel held, taking it without waiting, his eyes moving rapidly now, scanning, cross-checking, searching for fault, for exaggeration, for anything that would reduce the impact. He found structure instead. He found clarity. He found a pattern that did not belong to error. The silence stretched, longer than before, heavier, pressing against the edges of the room. Someone at the far end whispered a question that did not carry, but the tension did. Richard's grip on the tablet tightened just slightly, not enough to show strain, but enough to register resistance. "Get me the source," he said finally, his voice lower now, controlled in a different way, not dismissing, not commanding, but containing something that had begun to shift beneath certainty. No one moved immediately. The request lingered, not because it was unclear, but because it pointed towards something none of them had expected to matter. Across the city, in a small apartment where the morning light filtered through a thin curtain, Ava Johnson stood by the window with a cup of coffee held steady in her hands, her gaze resting on nothing in particular, her expression calm, unchanged, as if the movement unfolding miles away was simply a continuation of something she had already accounted for, and while the building of glass and steel filled with questions it had not prepared to ask, she remained still, grounded in the quiet certainty that the truth, once set in motion, did not need to rush to arrive. The conference room did not erupt into chaos. It settled into something quieter, heavier, like a weight pressing down on every surface, and for the first time that morning, no one reached for their keyboard, no one scrolled, no one pretended the numbers would rearrange themselves if given enough time. Richard Coleman stood at the head of the table, the tablet still in his hand, but he was no longer scanning it. His gaze fixed somewhere just past the screen, as if the answer might exist in the space between what he had approved and what now stood undeniable. The city stretched beyond the glass behind him, sunlight reflecting off distant buildings, steady and indifferent, a reminder that outside this room, nothing had changed, but inside, something had already begun to shift in ways that could not be undone. He set the tablet down slowly, the soft contact against the table louder than expected, drawing every eye back to him without a word. "Walk me through it again," he said, his voice controlled, but lower now, stripped of the certainty that had filled it the night before. Daniel Reyes nodded once, stepping closer to the screen, his movements precise, respectful, but no longer hesitant, and as he began explaining the sequence, again, pointing to each connection, each overlooked clause, each structural shift in liability, the room listened differently this time, not to confirm what they already believed, but to understand what they had missed. One executive leaned back in his chair, fingers pressed lightly against his lips, another adjusted her glasses, eyes narrowing as she followed the logic deeper, and somewhere near the end of the table, someone quietly closed a folder that no longer mattered. Richard did not interrupt, did not challenge, did not redirect, he simply listened, his posture still, his expression unreadable, but his focus absolute, as if each word was being measured against something internal, something older than this deal, something that had shaped how he moved through decisions without second-guessing. When Daniel finished, the silence that followed did not ask for permission to stay, it settled fully, filling the room with a clarity that no one could avoid. Richard exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that did not release tension so much as acknowledge it, and he turned slightly, looking at the screen again, not scanning now, but seeing, truly seeing, the structure laid out before him, the pattern that had been there all along. "This does not come from inside," he said finally, not as a question, but as a conclusion. Daniel shook his head. "No, sir." Richard's eyes shifted, just slightly, toward the edge of the table, toward nothing in particular, but something had entered his awareness, something small and precise, like a sentence left unfinished. Some mistakes do not disappear. The words did not echo, they did not demand attention, but they were there, quiet and persistent, threading through the moment without force. His jaw tightened just a fraction, then released. "Find her," he said, the directive clear now, not driven by authority, but by necessity. No one asked who, no one needed clarification. The source had already become the center of gravity in a room that had built itself on control. Chairs shifted, devices lit up again, movement returning not as routine, but as response. Across the city, in a small apartment filled with morning light, Ava Johnson sat at her desk once more, the notebook open, the same page visible, though nothing new had been written. Her pen rested beside it, untouched, her hands folded loosely in front of her, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested patience rather than waiting. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock and the distant sound of traffic moving through the streets below, ordinary sounds that carried no urgency. No indication that somewhere else, decisions were being re-examined, priorities shifting, control loosening its grip. Ava glanced at the notebook, then at the closed laptop, her expression unchanged, calm, grounded, as if the outcome unfolding was not something she needed to monitor, but something she trusted to arrive on its own time. She reached for her coffee, now lukewarm, took a small sip, and set it back down with the same quiet precision she had shown the night before. Outside, the sunlight moved slowly across the buildings, casting long reflections that shifted by degrees, subtle and inevitable, and inside the glass tower miles away, Richard Coleman stood in a room that no longer felt entirely his, holding the awareness that the certainty he had relied on had not been broken by noise or force, but by something quieter, something he had chosen to ignore. And now, for the first time in a long time, he did not move immediately to fix it, he simply stood there, letting the silence settle, letting the truth remain exactly where it was. The search did not begin with noise or urgency, it began with quiet precision, the kind that moved through systems without drawing attention, and within minutes the name attached to the email was no longer just a sender but a trail, a series of small, ordinary details that when aligned revealed something far less ordinary. Daniel Reyes stood near the glass wall with his tablet in hand, scrolling through the minimal data they had pulled, each line offering just enough to confirm identity but not enough to explain capability. Ava Johnson, he said quietly, almost testing the name against the weight it now carried, and across the room Richard Coleman did not respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the skyline beyond. The glass as if distance might sharpen clarity. Employment records show she was part-time service staff at one of our restaurants. Daniel continued, his voice steady but edged with something new, something that bordered on disbelief. Terminated last night. The room shifted again, not dramatically, but enough for several heads to turn toward Richard, not accusing, not questioning, but aligning the timeline in silence. Richard's expression did not break, but something in his posture changed. Subtle, almost imperceptible, like a structure adjusting under new weight. That is not possible, one executive said, leaning forward, eyes narrowing as he reviewed the data again. This level of analysis requires training, access, experience. Daniel nodded once, already anticipating the objection, and tapped to open another tab. There is more, he said, turning the tablet slightly so it faced the table. Archived academic records, partial transcript from a finance program, top percentile. Performance withdrew before completion. Another line followed, quieter but heavier. Family connection to a former chief financial officer involved in a liability case 5 years ago. The air tightened, not from confusion now, but from recognition that the pattern extended beyond the document, beyond the numbers, into something that had history, context, consequence. Richard's hand moved slightly along the edge of the table, fingers pressing just enough to anchor himself, and for the first time since entering the room, he looked away from the skyline and toward the screen with full attention, not scanning, not assessing, but absorbing. The name settled differently now, no longer external, no longer distant, it connected. Bring her in, he said, the words quiet but carrying authority reshaped by awareness rather than assumption. No one questioned the directive. Within minutes, calls were placed, messages sent, a location confirmed, the movement efficient, controlled. But beneath it ran a current that none of them voiced, the understanding that the person they were seeking was not simply a source, but the center of something they had failed to see, across the city. The morning had deepened, sunlight now stronger, casting clearer lines through the narrow streets, and Ava Johnson stepped out of her building with the same steady pace she had carried the night before, her tote over her shoulder, her posture relaxed, as if the world around her remained unchanged. She walked past a small corner store, the bell above the door chiming as someone entered behind her, the sound brief and ordinary. She did not check her phone, did not look back, did not pause at the intersection. She stopped as the light held red, cars passing in a steady stream, their reflections moving across her face in soft shifts of brightness and shadow. For a moment, she closed her eyes, just briefly, as if measuring the stillness within the movement, then opened them again, her gaze clear, focused, present. Somewhere above the street, in a building of glass and steel, her name was being spoken in rooms she had never entered. Her work being examined by people who had never seen her, and decisions were already shifting direction because of something she had chosen to act on without recognition, without permission. The light changed. She stepped forward, crossing the street with quiet certainty, unaware of the car that slowed at the corner, unaware of the eyes that now followed her not out of dismissal, but out of necessity. Back in the conference room, Richard Coleman stood still as the information settled fully into place. The connection complete, the distance between action and consequence closed. He did not speak again right away. He did not issue another command. He simply stood there, holding the awareness that the person he had dismissed less than 24 hours ago had just altered the course of a decision he had believed was already finished, and for the first time in that room, the balance of power did not shift loudly, it shifted in silence, in understanding, in the quiet realization that what had been overlooked was now the only thing that mattered. The car did not use its siren and it did not rush through traffic, it moved with quiet intention, stopping half a block ahead of Ava Johnson as she stepped onto the sidewalk, her pace unchanged, her posture steady. The morning light now fully settled across the street, turning windows into bright reflections that made everything look sharper than it felt. The rear door opened before she reached it, not abruptly, not demanding, just present. And a man in a dark suit stepped out, adjusting his jacket with a motion that carried both professionalism and restraint. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice calm, measured, not confrontational, not familiar. "Mr. Coleman would like to speak with you." Ava did not stop immediately, her gaze resting on him for a brief second, not startled, not defensive, simply observing, as if weighing the moment against something already known. The sounds of the street continued around them, a delivery truck idling nearby, a pedestrian crossing signal clicking. In steady rhythm, the ordinary movement of the city pressing on without pause. "I am on my way somewhere," she replied, her tone even, her words not dismissive, just precise. The man nodded slightly, as if expecting resistance, or perhaps understanding it, and stepped aside just enough to remove himself from her path without blocking it. "It will not take long," he said. "But it matters." The phrase lingered not because of how it was said, but because of what it implied. Ava's eyes shifted past him to the car, its tinted windows reflecting the buildings across the street, hiding everything inside. For a moment, the world narrowed into that reflection, into the quiet space between choice and movement. Then she adjusted the strap of her tote on her shoulder and stepped forward, not hurried, not reluctant, simply choosing. Inside the car, the air was cooler, controlled, carrying a faint scent of leather and something understated, something that did not try to announce itself. The door closed softly behind her, sealing the outside noise into a distant hum. Richard Coleman sat across from her, his posture straight, his hands resting lightly on his knees, not holding anything, not hiding anything, his expression composed but no longer distant. For the first time since she had seen him, he did not look through her, he looked at her. The silence between them was not empty, it was filled with everything that had already happened, everything that had shifted without words. Ava sat without speaking, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze steady, her presence grounded in a way that did not need to assert itself. The car began to move, slow at first, merging back into the flow of traffic, the city sliding past in reflections along the window. Richard inhaled once, controlled, then spoke. His voice quieter than it had been the night before, not diminished, but changed. "You sent the analysis," he said, not asking, not accusing, simply acknowledging. Ava did not look away. "Yes," she replied. A pause followed, longer than expected, as if both of them understood that the next words would not return anything to what it had been. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, then released. "You were right," he said. The admission did not come easily, but it came clean, without decoration, without defense. Outside, a traffic light shifted from red to green, the glow washing briefly across the interior of the car before fading again. Ava watched the reflection move across the glass, then back to him. "That was not the point," she said, her tone calm, her words carrying no edge, only clarity. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus, as if recalibrating the conversation. "Then what was?" he asked. Ava held his gaze for a moment, the silence stretching just enough to make the answer matter. "That you signed it without seeing it," she said. The words landed without force, but they did not need it. They settled, precise, unavoidable. Richard looked down briefly, his hands still, his reflection faint in the polished surface beside him. The city continued to move outside, unaware, unchanged, but inside the car, something had already shifted fully into place. He looked back up, his expression no longer guarded in the same way, something quieter now, something that did not rely on control. "Come back," he said, the words direct, but not commanding. "Not as staff, not as before, as part of the team. I need someone who sees what others miss." Ava did not respond immediately. She turned her gaze toward the window again, watching the buildings pass in steady sequence, the light shifting across their surfaces, constant and indifferent. When she spoke, her voice remained the same, even, grounded, untouched by the offer itself. "You did not need me to see it," she said softly. "You needed to stop ignoring it." The car slowed as it approached another intersection, the outside world pausing briefly before moving again. And inside that quiet space, the distance between them was no longer defined by position or title, but by something simpler, something harder to shift, understanding. And for the first time, Richard Coleman did not try to close that distance with authority, he simply sat with it, listening, as the person he had dismissed less than a day before spoke without raising her voice, without asking for anything, and without needing to prove anything at all. The car came to a gradual stop beneath the mirrored face of the building, the engine settling into a low hum before going quiet, and for a moment neither of them moved, the city's reflection stretching across the glass around them, fractured and soft in the shifting light of late morning. Richard Coleman's hand rested against the door handle but did not push, his posture no longer rigid. No longer anchored in the same certainty that had guided him through rooms like this without pause, and across from him Ava Johnson sat still, her gaze drifting once toward the entrance, then back to nothing in particular, as if the destination itself held no urgency. Outside, a breeze moved through the narrow space between buildings, stirring loose papers near the curb, lifting them just enough to turn and settle again, small motion against the larger stillness. Richard finally stepped out, the sound of the door closing behind him softer than expected, and for a brief second he remained beside the car, looking up at the glass tower that had always reflected his decisions back at him without question, but now held something else, something less certain, something quieter. Inside the lobby, the air was cool and controlled, footsteps echoing lightly against polished floors, conversations muted into background texture. And as he walked forward, those familiar sounds did not meet him the same way, they passed through him, unanchored. He paused near the center of the space, not blocking the flow, not directing it, simply standing there, his reflection faint beneath his feet, distorted by the shine. Above him, elevators opened and closed in steady rhythm. People moved in and out without noticing the stillness that had settled into him, the kind of stillness that did not demand attention. Behind him, the car door opened again, and Ava stepped out, her movement unhurried, her posture unchanged, the same quiet presence she had carried through every moment before this one. She did not walk beside him, did not follow, she simply moved in her own direction, crossing the edge of the lobby where sunlight slipped through the glass and pooled across the floor in long, soft lines. For a second, that light caught along her shoulder, her face, illuminating without spotlight, then she continued forward, passing through it without stopping. Richard turned slightly, not fully. Just enough to see the motion, to register it without interrupting it, and in that small shift, something settled deeper, something that did not need to be named. No apology filled the space, no final words reshaped what had already been understood, only the quiet awareness that remained, steady and present. Ava reached the far doors, her hand pressing lightly against the handle, and as it opened, the outside air moved in again. Warmer now, carrying the distant sounds of the street traffic. Footsteps, life continuing without pause. She stepped through without looking back, the door easing shut behind her with a soft, controlled click that barely registered against the larger rhythm of the building. Richard stood where he was, his hands at his sides, his gaze lowering just slightly as the reflection beneath him shifted with passing movement, and for the first time in that space, he did not move to follow, did not call her name, did not reach for control or correction. He simply stood there, breathing in the cool air, feeling the subtle weight of something changed settle into place. Above him, the glass caught the sunlight and held it, steady and silent, while outside Ava walked into the brightness of the street, her steps even, her figure gradually blending into the motion of the city, not disappearing, but becoming part of something larger, something that did not need recognition to remain real. And inside, Richard Coleman remained still for a moment longer, listening to the quiet he had never noticed before turning, not quickly, not slowly, just enough to continue forward, carrying with him a silence that no longer felt empty.